Welcome to the panel on commodities and gender, agriculture, fisheries, dairy, and extractive sectors with the speakers, Professor Nursel Aydier-Avsar of Akdeniz University, Turkey. She's an associate professor of economics with research interests in the field of development economics, labor economics, and the economics of gender. Following, we have Extractive Lukanga from the World Forum of Fish Harvesters and Fish Workers, which is an international network of small-scale fisher organizations to establish and uphold the fundamental human rights, social justice, and culture of small-scale fish harvesters and fish workers. Speaking on dairy and livestock, we have Azra Sayeed of Roots for Equity. She runs this Karachi-based organization that works with small and landless peasants. She works actively on women's rights and peasants' rights. Speaking on extractives, we have Pauline Vande-Pallen of the Third World Network from Africa. Pauline was educated at the University of Ghana with a BA in French and Psychology and the Institute for Social Studies in The Hague, Netherlands. She's a program officer on gender and economic policy in TWN Africa. I am your moderator, Dr. Skeete of the Sridhar Ramphal Center for Trade at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus here in beautiful Barbados. Please note, each speaker has approximately 12 minutes to present, and we will follow with a question and answer segment. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to the UNCTAD 15 Gender and Development Forum. Today, I would like to give you an overview of gender inequalities that women face in agricultural production and trade, and possible measures to address them. My presentation is based on several UNCTAD studies produced by UNCTAD Trade, Gender and Development Program that I also list at the end of my presentation. I will first start with the roles that women play in agriculture, then gender inequalities they face as workers and producers, and finally some areas of policy intervention. Let us first look at the roles that women play in agriculture. Agriculture is a major source of employment for women, especially in low-income countries. It corresponds to around 60% of female employment, and it is particularly the case in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And we see that women are involved in trade in the agricultural sectors in multiple ways, and mainly as contributing family workers, as farmers on their own account, and these are the two forms of vulnerable employment dominated by women. Also as entrepreneurs running on and off farm businesses and as wage workers. And we see that often these economic roles blend together, so it's not easy to distinguish a line. And family farming, traditionally, as we all know, is the major activity of women in agriculture. However, small-scale fisheries, livestock raising, forestry and agroforestry value chains are also important, as we will discuss in this panel today. Women dominate subsistence activities and are less involved in commercial agriculture. And in that sense, we can say that they are more prone to the influx of cheap food imports that lower the price of their own produce. At the same time, there is this shift that we see over the last few decades, mainly from more traditional export crops such as coffee and sugar to non-traditional agricultural export crops such as fruits, vegetables, and flowers. And of course, since these non-traditional agricultural exports are more labor-intensive to both produce and process, this shift opens new job opportunities for women outside the family farm. And for example, employers prefer women in pack houses mainly due to gender stereotypes about women's perceived dexterity in handling fragile produce. Let us now continue with the implications of gender inequalities for wage workers in agriculture. In agriculture, women engage with international trade more through wage employment on estate farms or packing houses than directly through the product market. Women also play a critical role as unpaid family workers in cash crop production. However, when we look at wage employment of women in agriculture, we see that it tends to be seasonal and temporary. It's also characterized by a high degree of occupational gender segregation in the sense that women are concentrated in low skilled and low paying jobs as opposed to men who are more evenly distributed across different job groups. And women also experience the gender wage gap. Additionally, women face the double burden of combining paid work with their unpaid domestic and care work responsibilities. As we all know, these type of unpaid work in the reproductive sphere is always women's responsibility in most societies. Despite these shortcomings about wage employment, still most jobs in non-traditional agricultural exports require higher skills and therefore pay more than the alternatives in subsistence agriculture. In that sense, they play a role in empowering women in rural areas, even though, of course, there are issues that needs to be addressed. So it's not that there are not issues, but there is a role of empowerment as well. Overall, we can say that in agricultural wage employment, women's low wages and lower bargaining power make them a source of competitive advantage, borrowing from Diane Aston, for exporting firms in international markets. So in other words, firms manage to stay competitive in international markets thanks to cost cutting through employing cheap female labor. This is what we see on the wage side, wage workers side of the story. When we move on to the case of producers, we see that women farmers face various gender supply side constraints. And these all limit their capacity to produce in large quantities and also to export. Let us look at them briefly next. First of all, due to lack of formal land titling, women often manage land. They cultivate it without any land use rights. So this limits their ability to borrow because in most cases, land is used as the collateral to get a loan from a financial institution. Without credit in turn, they have limited access to agricultural inputs such as fertilizers, tools, hire tractors, irrigation schemes, and labor. And this in turn prevents them from expanding production and exporting. So we see a sort of chain of reactions here. Second, women face issues with accessing market information due to limited access to technology and the internet, and also due to their more restricted interactions with their surroundings, given the societal gender norms in most societies. They also have issues in enhancing their productivity without having access to technological tools and equipment. Third, as with technology, women have unequal access to extension services. And this is mainly because these services often target higher value cash crops, which are traditionally dominated by male farmers. Fourth, Women have issues with meeting phytosanitary standards as well as product and process regulations, which are required in international markets. They also face market entry barriers, such as private standards or voluntary labeling requirements. Finally, we see that women face time and mobility constraints as well. And this is mainly due to gender norms and societal traditions, as we all know, and they directly affect their capacity to produce. All of these supply side constraints in turn undermine women farmers' capacity to export, and in that sense make them underachievers of competitive advantage as producers in agriculture. After having looked at the roles that women play in agriculture and the various gender inequalities that they need to deal with, let us now turn to what needs to be done. And of course, this is a long list, but I will try to give some examples at least. We know that it's essential to reduce these gender inequalities to be able to support women's participation in trade in agriculture. Here, I will highlight some of the key areas and possible measures that could be taken. We know that agricultural extension services are critical for production in agriculture, and these services need to be scheduled and organized, taking into account women's household responsibilities and cultural norms. For example, childcare facilities could be provided at the training sites, and hours of training could be adjusted according to women's needs. Also, female extension agents could be employed to reach female farmers more easily, and this is especially important in more traditional societies. Producer organizations and cooperatives play an important role in rural areas in terms of access to capital, marketing channels, and technical assistance. Therefore, we need to encourage these entities, and also we need to ease membership procedures at these entities, for example, by reducing the amount of paperwork, which is a bigger burden on women because of their lower education. In terms of structured supply chains, contract farming arrangements could link procurement to women's participation in production. That could be a way forward. Also, public procurement schemes could give priority to small-scale women producers. In terms of infrastructure investment, transportation, storage and processing facilities, irrigation schemes are all critical for agricultural productivity. And such investment also reduces women's time burden and helps them close the gender gap in productivity. So these investments are critical to support both men and women, of course, in agriculture. In terms of training and skill development, technical training programs, for example, on post-harvest handling and processing techniques are important to increase the capacity to export. This is a major constraint faced by women. Business development assistance, for example, on marketing and accounting, could also be helpful to overcome market entry barriers in foreign markets. And in terms of access to land and credit, land tenure systems need to be made more gender equitable, and land use rights need to be expanded for women. Also, access to credit could be expanded through government guaranteed lending programs, also through structured supply chain finance schemes in the case of contract farming, and through trade finance programs. Of course, I'm just giving some highlights. Each of these titles require more time. And to reduce the unpaid work burden of women, public childcare facilities need to be introduced and expanded also in rural areas, so they concentrate in urban areas, as we know. And in terms of trade policy, tariffs and non-tariff measures that hurt women need to be addressed. Tariff protection is a tool that could be used selectively for food security purposes, for example. And another trade policy measure, trade facilitation measures, could aim to reduce the cost of trading also for smaller firms and not just large companies. Hence, this way they can benefit more women. And of course, trade policy is important, but it's not sufficient alone. They need to be complemented with targeted domestic policies to reduce gender inequalities in each relevant area. So it's a holistic approach to policy making and not just a single one, in my view. And another important issue to keep in mind, last few points to address, policy intervention should go beyond traditional female sectors and should also target higher valued agricultural sectors and ease women's access transition to them. And finally, in terms of wage employment, there is need for globally accepted minimum labor standards at the minimum or international cooperation to avoid the race to the bottom. I know it's a big separate discussion, and probably it is the hardest item to realize, but I think it's important to keep in mind. These are some of the points that I wanted to raise, and thank you very much for your attention.
Next, we have Dr. Sayeed speaking on dairy and livestock.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I will be speaking on the dairy sector, as has been mentioned, and its critical importance, especially the livestock sector to women farmers, especially landless farmers in Pakistan. In Pakistan, almost 80% of employed women are in agriculture. And what is of importance is that we have 4 provinces, of which one province, Punjab, is the biggest in terms of agriculture production. It has 80% of agriculture production of Pakistan. And it is estimated that in this province of Punjab, 90% of livestock is taken care of by women. Please note that almost 70-80% of Pakistan's livestock is in Punjab. However, livestock is of critical importance to women in every province. At the same time, the situation of landholding needs to be highlighted. Currently in Pakistan, according to the government of Pakistan's data, 5% of large landholders are in control of 64% of the total farmland. And that in our country is known as feudalism. Only 65% of small-scale farmers have control over only 15% of total agricultural land. And even more horrendous than all of this data is that women's ownership of agricultural land is no more than 1%, only 1%. So the reason I'm concentrating on livestock is because of regulatory developments in the dairy sector in the past few years. However, before I go into these matters, let me highlight the interconnectedness of women's lives to land, livestock, and livelihood. As I said earlier, almost all farmers, especially women, are landless. So livestock is a critical asset which has multiple benefits for women. Livestock reproduces, and hence the increase in livestock through their offspring increases women's assets ownership, which we know they use in emergencies to sell, in death, in a healthcare problem, in dowry needs, whatever they have. They have no cash. We all know that our rural economies have no cash there. It's all still in kind. And so in order to have access to cash, selling livestock is the most commonly used form of gaining access to cash. So apart from that, dairy cattle is also a source of rich nutrition for rural households. There is milk, there is what we call lassi, it's a yogurt drink. There's butter from milk, and then there is clarified butter from milk, all of which is often used as a sole consumption for rural households with either roti or what we in English call wheaten bread, chapati or roti. So the women's household food security needs are through the milk from dairy sector, and even also a source of daily income, because the surplus these women will sell for their daily income, for obtaining other products like vegetables, sometimes even for buying small bits of household goods, sheets, or whatever clothes. During COVID-19, we observed across the country that the women were using dairy products for their daily consumption. They had no access to the market, and milk was the only fallback they had. And if there had been no milk, we would have seen much more dire hunger and poverty in the country. We also observed that during the lockdown, women would come walking across the streets in the rural communities, calling out to ask people if anybody wanted to buy butter or clarified butter. So we know that they were using this dairy product not only during COVID, but this has been the pattern since the history of my country and even beyond, because Pakistan is a very ancient, part of a very ancient civilization, the Indus Valley civilization. Again, the government failure can be seen that women have no source of energy for cooking or meeting other daily needs, such as heating water or whatever, wherever you need energy. So across the country, women fall back on either using wood or animal dung from their livestock, which they burn for their cooking stove. We have also seen that women would go to the bigger landlords or people who have more animals to take up the dung and make the cakes for them, the animal dung cakes for them, and they don't get paid for it. They keep half the dung, the cakes for themselves, and give it back to the owner, half of them. Secondly, they don't have land, so they will actually lease land, which is extremely expensive, to grow fodder, because animals are of extreme importance to them. 1 acre of land will yield about fodder for about 8 livestock. So again, I make the point that land, livestock, and livelihood are closely connected to women's daily lives. The forces of feudalism and patriarchy have made it very difficult for women to access either decent livelihood or even food security. And since trade liberalization in the 1990s, with the onset of neoliberalism, especially the formation of the World Trade Organization in 1995, things have become even more difficult. One can say it is the final straw on the camel's back. The government of Pakistan has implemented pure food laws since 2011, replacing older laws from the 1960s. These laws are directly connected to the WTO through its agreement known as the Sanitary Phytosanitary Agreement, or generally just called the SPS Agreement. What does SPS has to do with livestock? These agreements regulate all international standards for trade, especially of products from plants and animals. So hence the livestock meat or the milk now has to comply with certain international standards set through the Codex Alimentarius, which is what the WTO recognizes as the body which will govern the international standards ordained by the SPS. In essence, such regulatory standards means that only mega corporations like Nestle, Friesland Campina, and others meet the set standards according to the pure food laws. So now, just before COVID-19, the government of Punjab, which also complies with the pure food laws, has said that by 2022, they will ban sale of all loose milk or fresh milk in the markets. What does that mean for women? What does that mean for all our small farmers? It means that they will lose meat, access to meat. They will lose access to cash. They will lose access to nutrition, milk and other dairy products. And they will also lose access to a form of energy which is there for their food. A farmer in the northern parts of Pakistan just said to us in a meeting, so how do we eat our food? Do you want us to go hungry? Do we eat meat raw? What is the government of Pakistan asking us to do? And so that is exactly the sentiment across the country, and the people's movements, the farmers' movements, especially the women farmers' movements, have stood up and said that we will not allow the implementation of the Codex Alimentarius standards on dairy products. Please note that this is not the only diabolical agreement within the WTO. The TRIPS agreement also impacts the livestock sector because the semen of the livestock is now being traded by big countries like the United States and across Europe and even New Zealand and Australia. And we will see the same history of losing our indigenous seeds to be repeated with our very, very precious ancient lines of livestock. We have some of the most precious genetic resources in our region in Pakistan. Now, if they start using the TRIPS law against the semen of livestock, the same thing will happen in a very few years. In a matter of 5 years, we lost indigenous seeds in my country. And the same thing will happen with the SPS. What does it mean? It means that mega corporations will control milk, they will control butter, they will control clarified butter, and also fodder and fodder seeds. I will just give you a very small example, and that is that due to the European and the American markets, regulatory systems, they are saying about 10% of ethanol has to be used in fossil fuels, in the gasoline which they put into their cars. And a country like Pakistan, which is extremely water deficient, is now growing sugarcane crops all over the country so that they can make ethanol out of sugarcane. So we are losing land to food. Sugarcane is extremely high on water consumption. And who will lose? It is the women, because they will not have access to land. They do not have access to land in any case. And now, because sugarcane stands for a whole year, this is even further problematic. So when we talk about the SDG 5, when we talk about attaining SDG 5, how can we attain SDG 5 when we have international organizations like the WTO who have given the entire control of food and agriculture into corporations? And we know that there is a big movement right now in India, in many of the countries, and also against the UN Food Summit. For this very particular reason, that the corporations are being given so much importance. So a set of recommendations from the women's movement in Pakistan, from the farmers' movement in Pakistan, is that women farmers are the guardians and caretakers of livestock through ancient times, and this needs to be absolutely safeguarded. Second, women must be given, there has to be an equitable distribution of land with women in the forefront of being the beneficiaries of equitable distribution. We are asking farmers' movement to push for food sovereignty and debunk the private sector, the corporations who are emphasizing that they need to control food and agriculture, especially the livestock and the dairy sector. We need to, of course, build the people's movement, the women farmers movement, but I would like to say that the almost a criminalization of farmers across the world, especially in Asia, has been a real problem. And that means that women who also are faced with patriarchy and feudalism need to further go back. You know, women in Pakistan are already so cut off into private spheres. The crackdown on the government is further creating problems, and that is a major concern. And the government is doing this on the behalf of course, the corporations. We really demand that the government helps our small producers in transforming food systems that are based on traditional farming practices. If they need to promote agroecology and quit promoting neoliberal agriculture, which has now claimed not only lives and livelihoods of women farmers, but is also a major contributor to climate change, which is now a climate emergency. And in this week, we have seen the impacts so clearly. There is a key demand, of course, which I've already said, is equitable land distribution, but also seed sovereignty. Lastly, when we talk about the health of farmers, because they're saying that the farmers, the milk sold by farmers is unsafe, is contaminated, is of poor quality, then how we have survived from the Indus Valley civilization to this day? Because in Pakistan and parts of India, milk is such a valued nutritional source. If it was unsafe, how did we overcome these many millennia of living on milk? So we are saying that people-led science needs to be used for safety and health standards of the people, and not corporate profit-oriented science, which is meant to grab control over productive resources, which include, of course, land, livestock, and seeds from farming communities. With these recommendations, I finish, and I urge everybody to look at the livestock dairy sector, which is being overrun by corporations from the northern parts of the world, and this will further disbalance the many problems that we already face in terms of equity, in terms of equality, in terms of women's rights, in terms of people's rights, hunger and poverty. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sayeed, for your informative presentation. As we move on, we have our final panelists. Speaking on extractives, I invite Ms. Pauline Vande-Pallen from the Third World Network in Africa.
So thank you. I'm very happy to be part of this panel. Now, when we think about UNCTAD, given that this is happening as within the context of UNCTAD, we need to remember that UNCTAD was created in response to the dissatisfaction on the part of developing countries at the time with the global trade order, which was very heavily skewed in favor of developing countries. And UNCTAD's mission then was to help rebalance international trade relationships, which were weighted against the global south and developing countries. Now, since then, UNCTAD's mission, as we can see, is involved in supporting developing countries to transform their primary commodity export-dependent economies and help promote domestic production. Now, as we look at the world right now, we think that this mission is even more critical. As in the period since structural adjustment, efforts by African and other developing countries to transform their economies and industrialize have been brought to a halt. Many African countries have since then become dependent on their extractive sectors and primary commodity exports as sources of revenue. And with the COVID pandemic, which has left many of our economies much weaker, we see our countries focusing even more on the extractive sector as low-hanging fruit, which they can tap for sources of revenue. Now, since the colonial time, the political economy of mineral extraction and other resources has been dominated by transnational corporations and transnational capital. And these are coming predominantly from advanced and developing countries. Now, that domination from the colonial time was reinforced by the structural adjustment programs, which had the primary focus of attracting foreign investors and foreign direct investment. In our case, particularly within the extractive sector. The extractive sector was a particularly attractive sector for foreign investors. Now, what this did, the effect of this was wide-ranging in terms of financial flows out of poorer countries, the weakness in developing domestic linkages, and it affected domestic production and impacted livelihoods of the local people. Now, for us, one of the most insidious, one of the most affected areas in the extractive sector was in the marginalization of domestic small-scale mining activities in favor of large-scale mining corporations. And we saw that artisanal and small-scale mining activities in particular were particularly targeted. For the longest time, artisanal mining activities were made illegal. It's only in recent times that the governments have seen that artisanal mining is an important mining space and it's in need of attention. But for this presentation, I'd like to focus particularly on Ghana's small-scale salt mining sector, because salt is a particularly interesting case in point. As we all know, salt salt is very much a renewable commodity. And in Ghana, although we are known quite a lot across Africa for gold production, in the West African region, we have a dominance in terms of salt production as well. In Ghana, salt has been produced by artisanal and small-scale women miners for hundreds of years. According to some statistics, women dominate the sector by nearly as much as 80%. And you find them in the different parts of the in different roles. We have women as buyers, from concession holders, those who actually participate in the mining itself. I mean, they go along the value chain. And we have produced not simply for our local markets, as I said, but we have been exporting to countries along the west coast of Africa. Now, even during the colonial times, the recognition that salt was important, and therefore the attempt to gain control over salt saw the colonists trying to import salt to crush the local salt production. But that didn't work, and in a sense, the local salt production stood its ground against imports, and actually is still ongoing today. But what we're seeing, and women have been producing salt as part of cooperatives. It's very much a community effort. So communities are dependent on salt production. Communities are seeing livelihoods. People are gaining education. It's an intrinsic part of various communities. But our salt sector also offers us a very clear and tragic example of how small-scale women producers are being pushed out by the state, who not only support their efforts, but also in seeking to attract foreign direct investment, are actually trying to crush the activities of small-scale salt producers, and it's going to their detriment. Now, what we have seen is that as governments are trying to broaden the types of commodities that they are producing, there's a renewed interest in salt, because as you might be aware, salt is used in virtually every industry that we might think about. And our salt production has been used both for the domestic and industrial uses. But instead of supporting and encouraging artisanal and small-scale salt, which has sustained the industry all this time, rather government is looking to bring in foreign and large-scale producers, and in doing so, they are restricting the spaces, and in some cases, completely taking the space over from the women salt producers. Government is giving concessions to investors that seem to ignore the already ongoing salt production. Just last year, although trade was affected greatly by the bans on movement as a result of COVID, in one of our largest salt producing spaces, the Aydier-Avsar lagoon, government granted nearly the entire lagoon as a concession to one company, which has not had any experience in salt mining whatsoever, under the notion that that company was going to bring in jobs. Now, in a space where over 20,000 people are working, the company is promising jobs of up to about 5,000 and maybe at its peak 10,000. How it's going to account for the rest, it's offering to put women into spaces where they have no expertise, they may have no land, they may have no access to resources. And bear in mind, our women have been producing in very hostile territory. They have no access to any formal means of finance. There are very little protections by way of policy support for them. And they are essentially making their way on by their own. And so this move by government, very reminiscent of a structural adjustment type move to introduce big companies to take over the space where small people are is extremely worrying. Now, beyond simply government taking over the space, we're seeing increasingly government using the state security forces to quell dissension or to harness those who may be resistant to change. Just this week, we've seen a number of arrests taking place, and even one was ours, simply because government working essentially on the part of the large scale company is trying to quell dissension. Now, this is important as we're looking at the upcoming UNCTAD meeting for a number of reasons. We must see new commitments from our governments for policies that protect and enhance access to productive resources, particularly for small and medium-scale domestic producers in general, and women producers in particular. And that would be something that we will be looking to see during this UNCTAD meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pauline, for that informative presentation. As we look to conclude this panel on commodities and gender, we've heard presentations on agriculture, fisheries, livestock and dairy farmers, as well as small salt mining. One thing that stands out has been the role of trade, but specifically non-tariff measures, sanitary and phytosanitary standards, and how they continue to inhibit trade, specifically in the global south. My question to the panelists, with the theme Prosperity for All, what would you like to see for the UNCTAD 15th mandate in the areas of trade, of agriculture, dairy and livestock farming, fisheries, and the extractive sectors?
Thank you very much for this interesting panel and the presentation. In terms of the mandate, actually, when I think about it, I have a very broad one, not very specific one, but I think it's important to keep in mind at all stages of policy making, just to remind ourselves that any issue that we look at has a gender aspect. So there is nothing gender neutral in these policy areas that we look at. So in the case of agriculture, I would be happy to see that there is this emphasis on taking into consideration the gender inequalities and gender aspect of agriculture and trade issues while designing programs, projects, and government interventions, and also while implementing them. So just reminding ourselves that we need to have a gender lens whenever we approach any project. I know it could not be easy in certain areas because it's not very direct, but just to remind ourselves the need to have lens is very important in my view. So that is one thing that comes to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you.
I already made my recommendations earlier.
Yes.
But with respect to livestock sector, we cannot, I think that is the problem with capitalism in essence, that it really is very deductive. And agriculture is very intertwined with livestock, with crops, with vegetables. And it is almost an internal system where one input is used as an output and the other output is used as an input. It's very circular. And so when you disturb that system, the whole thing crashes down and it creates markets for corporations. Like if you take away, if you put regulatory mechanisms on milk, then the women will have to buy milk and butter and ghee and everything from the market. And that's really good for the corporations. But we all know that they do not have the buying power. So for us, agriculture and livestock is not different. It is a complex one unit system. And first and foremost, there should be no intellectual property rights agreements which control seed or livestock, number one. And because they are both part of biodiversity, that is what they are doing. They are controlling biodiversity with the crashing down of the climate systems. I think that is really, it will hurt the entire humanity and the ecological systems of our world. We will not be able to live as we have lived over the millennia, number one. Second is equitable distribution of land is critical. Across the world, and especially in South Asia, land distribution is highly tilted in favor of very big landlords. And with the new liberal laws that have changed, allowed corporations to come into our land and access and grab land, it means that the entire land market is open to corporations apart from the feudals who already control land. So we really need equitable distribution of land. And that is part of the GR34 of the CEDAW, as you know very well. So it's not something new that we're talking about. We're talking about asking for equitable distribution of land in the name of women. Everybody knows that in order to empower women, that is one of the most powerful tools that we have in the hands of our governments to ensure that women have access to land. It has a whole range of impact on livelihood, on nutrition, on empowerment of women, fighting against patriarchy, and so on and so forth. So that is very critical with the dairy sector. And lastly, the regulatory mechanisms cannot be controlled by the corporations. They have no right to tell us how we consume anything. I mean, the kind of fast food that these corporations are selling in the markets, the processed meat that they're selling in the markets, the milk packs. I mean, the rural women ask me all the time, when we have fresh milk in the house, even when we are very clean with the milk, we take so much precautions, it doesn't last more than 12 hours. How can they keep milk for 3 months in a pack? Is that nutrition? Chemical filtered food, is that nutrition? So we must ask for fresh, locally grown food products, including milk, and giving access to our rural communities to this freshly produced food products, which they produce in any case. But because of the poverty, the landlessness, the corporations, they are the last to eat. And they should be the first to eat. So we think that all regulatory health mechanisms have to be internally decided by the people. The government of Pakistan is not providing clean water to its communities, urban or rural. It is not providing health sanitary systems to the urban or the rural. So why are we suddenly talking about milk, which is already fresh, nutritious product? They have really no right to come and tell us that their milk is safe and our milk is not safe, it is contaminated. Those are very skewed policies and regulations. Thank you.
Access to resources is critical for women, especially women in small-scale extractive sector producers like the salt producers I was describing. Without access to finance, without access to markets, without access to all the needed elements, it becomes a challenge. And when there is no policy support for their work, it's a huge challenge. So what I would hope to see is our governments thinking much more concretely about how to support domestic producers, how to build domestic capacity. Let me say that.
Thank you so much to the panelists. We learned a lot about the injustices in the sectors of agriculture, salt mining, fisheries, and livestock farming. And now it's the opportunity for you, the audience, to pose your questions to the panelists.